in your hymnal number 188. There stands a rock. Do me. There stands a rock on shores of time that rears to heaven its head sublime. That rock is cleft, and they are blessed who find within this cleft a rest. Some build their hopes on the ever-drifting sand, some on their fame or their treasure or their land. Mine's on the rock that forever shall stand, Jesus, the rock of ages. That rock's a tower whose lofty height, illumined with heaven's unclouded night, hope's widest gates beneath the dome, where saints find rest with Christ at home. Some build their hopes on the ever-drifting sand, some on their fame or their treasure or their land. Mine's on the rock that forever shall stand, Jesus, the rock of ages. Now dismiss to our classes.
It's good to see everybody here this morning. Terry's really nervous about what I'm going to say before we even begin this gospel meeting, but I won't say anything bad. We are really thankful to have Brother Terry and Sister Beverly with us. I look forward to this gospel meeting. Terry has been working in the Arlington area for 23 years and been preaching for a number of years. See, I didn't say how many years, Terry. And I actually met Terry through Brother Shane Carrington. Don't hold that against Shane, but that's how we got to be friends. And I will give you just a little tidbit. When Rachel and I were very ill, and I was very ill with COVID, I got repeated texts from a lot of people, of course. And among those people that were close to me were Shane Carrington and Terry Slack. And I know that you will enjoy hearing him, and you'll appreciate the example that he sets for us, and we look forward to having you. So, Brother Terry, come ahead.
Well, good morning. I invite you, if you would, go ahead and turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 7 is where we're going to start. Appreciate Bruce's kind words this morning. I've looked forward to this ever since it got scheduled and then rescheduled, and it seems as though we just sort of start just getting a little bit of traction, and then we gotta tap the brakes again, and it makes me long for the time when we sort of get back at least to more of a semblance of normal. I don't know what. I've got a friend of mine, he says normal is a setting on a dryer and not much more than that. So whatever normal will be moving forward, but having gospel meetings and sort of getting a shot in the arm spiritually is certainly a step in the right direction. I appreciate so much the invitation to come to be a part of this effort, and hope that as we wrap up our time Wednesday night, that you will feel as though the time has been well invested, that you've been challenged in some things, that you've been encouraged in other things, and that we're all, when we conclude Wednesday night, that we're more focused on serving our Lord in whatever the future might hold for us as His people. Back when I was a kid, I'll let you do the math on that. Kind of, you get, let's see, he's been in Arlington for 23 years, so I know he didn't start when he was 10. But it was a time that you didn't have hundreds of channels on cable. You didn't have on-demand movies. You didn't have internet streaming. I know you young people are thinking, how in the world did you guys even live back in that day? For those of us who are a little older, you remember there were 3 networks. That was it, just 3. CBS, NBC, ABC, that was all. And one of those networks several years ago decided it'd be a good idea to broadcast a movie on an annual basis. It was a movie that had been released in 1939 starring a fairly young Judy Garland. And so in 1959, and I was not alive at that point in time, close, but not then, CBS decided that it would run The Wizard of Oz on one Sunday night every year. And it was something that my twin brother and I always looked forward to, the story of Dorothy. And when you're young, you know, you've seen the movie before, you still haven't gotten all of the pieces. But, you know, Dorothy, she runs away from home in order to protect her little dog Toto. She's tricked into returning home by Professor Marvel, and as she's traveling, she gets caught in the midst of a tornado. She can't get into the storm cellar where her family is. She takes refuge in her bedroom. And she, in the midst of the storm, is hit in the head by a flying window sash. And when she awakens, she is, or at least so we're led to believe, she's in a house that's spinning in circles up in the midst of the storm. The home eventually lands in Munchkin Land, and there she meets Glinda, who is the good witch of the East. And Glinda tells her that her only option is to seek help from the great and powerful Oz, but that would require, obviously, a trip where? To the Emerald City. Dorothy is concerned, and she says, but how do I start for the Emerald City? And Glinda responds, it's always best to start at the beginning, and all you do is follow the yellow brick road. Finding the Emerald City was simply a matter of following the right way. And Dorothy, in her travels, she's going to encounter some friends. She's going to have to overcome some sizable obstacles, but she is never going to get lost along the way. And it's not because she was so wise, and it's not because of her traveling companions or because she was so special. It's because that's where the yellow brick road took you. And as long as you stayed on that road, that was where you were going to end up. If you go out here and you get on I-40, if you go one direction, it's going to take you to North Carolina. And if you go another direction, it's going to take you to California. And it's never going to take you to New York because that's not where the road goes. But if you're going to go to California, if you get on I-40, you are going to get to California because that's where the road ends. And Oz was where, of course, the road ended up for Dorothy. Wouldn't it be great if there was a yellow brick road that just led us to some of the destinations that we desire most to go to? And I'm not talking about traveling physically. I'm talking about a fulfilling life, a satisfying marriage, a blessed family, a deeper relationship with God, and most of all, an eternal home in heaven. The bottom line is that it is our direction, much more than our intention, that determines our destination. That at this moment in time, every single one of us is traveling on a certain road, morally, a certain road ethically, and a certain road spiritually. And if we stay on that road, it is going to take us to a very specific destination. And the only way to change the destination is to change the road that we're on. Sometimes it boils down to a single decision that determines the road that we're on. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow night, that one decision in our life can be life-altering. And the decisions that we make along the way oftentimes are also interconnected. And so one decision starts us down a certain road, but if you're going to go to North Carolina, going east on I-40, you're going to have to make several decisions along the way not to get detoured and to stay on that path. It's the choices today that determine where we go tomorrow. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? Because we make a decision now, but sometimes the consequences of that decision is not made until a week, a month, a year, 2 years, sometimes a decade down the road. But wise is the person who uses that information to their benefit, to their advantage. Look at what Jesus has to say here in Matthew chapter 7. This is familiar ground for many of us. Verse 13. In chapter 7 of Matthew, in verse 13, Jesus is winding his way down here on the Sermon on the Mount. This is sort of he's starting into the invitation in our terminology today. And he says in verse 13, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small, and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it." Now, Jesus doesn't provide us with a literal yellow brick road to follow that takes us where we want to go, but that's not to say that he has left us to fend for ourselves, because he in essence says that every single one of us is traveling on one of two roads. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow night. But Jesus doesn't just sort of point us in the general direction of the narrow way and leave us hanging. As he concludes the Sermon on the Mount, verses 24 through 27, he sort of provides us there with a roadmap that helps us to maintain our travels on what he describes in these verses as the narrow way. In verse 24, "The one who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew, slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Here's the general idea of the narrow way. You listen to what God says, and you follow it. And as long as you're doing that, you're staying on the right path, the right road. Now this morning, what we're going to talk about is navigating that narrow way, 3 points, and then we'll conclude our time. The first one, by the way, just to sort of give you a heads up, that's the benefit of classes. You know that the preacher's got to quit at a certain time. So when, does Bruce, 3 points, and then you go through the first point, and it's like 45 minutes long, and you think, man, we got 2 more points to go, and if they're anything like the first point, we're in trouble. Okay, so the first point's going to be a little bit longer here, okay? But it's very simple. You lean on the Lord. You lean on the Lord. The one thing that put us all on the wrong road to begin with was our failure to do that, to submit to and to trust God. And so choosing the right way doesn't begin so much with information as it does with an attitude of submission, especially submission to the one who knows where every single road in life leads and where it doesn't lead. A trust in one who knows what is best for us better than we know what is best for ourselves. Now, if there's one guy who could have relied on his own ability, his own wisdom, his own insight in regard to what road to travel on outside of Jesus, who might that be? Smartest guy in the room. No guesses? Wisdom? That give you a clue? Solomon, okay? Solomon is the smartest guy in the room outside of Jesus. Look back at 1 Kings chapter 3. 1 Kings chapter 3, you remember that Solomon is getting set up into his new royal role. God communicates to him, this is 1 Kings chapter 3, God communicates to him in a dream, and in essence, he gives Solomon a blank check. He says at the end of verse 5, "Ask what you wish me to give you." Now if you were 20 years old and God gives you a blank check, what are you asking for? I look at myself, I'm fairly honest with myself. Wisdom is not probably high on the list, at least not when I was 20. What Solomon asks for, he recognizes that his role as a king is something that is divinely given. He says in verse 7 that he perceives himself as a little child who doesn't know how to go out or to come in. And so he asks God in verse 9 for an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. In short, wisdom. And God is so pleased with his request that you'll notice in verse 13 that he is also going to give to Solomon the things that he might have expected Solomon to ask for, and that, of course, being riches and honor. So if there's any person who might be tempted to trust in his own wisdom and insight, it would be Solomon. But Solomon has the wisdom to know better than to trust his own judgment alone. So flip over now to Proverbs chapter 3, and let's see what Solomon has to say there. Proverbs chapter 3, let's begin our reading in verse 5. Proverbs 3 and verse 5, Solomon says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths, your way, your road straight." Now that's pretty clear, isn't it? Don't trust in your heart. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on, don't prop yourself up on your own understanding. Don't look to provide your own way of support. That rather than doing that, rather than leaning on your own understanding, he says, instead lean on God. And so when the way that we're viewing something is in conflict with something that God has said, we are to trust what he has said and not trust in what we ourselves think. When what makes sense to us doesn't correspond to what God has revealed in his will, Solomon says, choose his way. Now, in our life, we're often prone, are we not, to make our decisions based on how something looks or how something feels to us. But Solomon says very clearly here, don't make that mistake. In spite of all that we know or we think we know, Solomon says, don't buy into the fallacy that you think that you are smart enough, you're wise enough, you're experienced enough, you're careful enough to rely on your own understanding. When it comes to choosing our roads in life, as we evaluate our options, Solomon says you start with the Lord and his wisdom. You trust in him, you lean on him and not on your own understanding, because your own understanding is going to take you to a place that you probably don't want to go to. Note what the smartest man in the room goes on to say. He doesn't say in some of your ways or even in most of your ways, but he says you lean on him in all of your ways. That is, in every area of life. So whether we're talking about dating or marriage, whether we're talking about education or work, whether we're talking about entertainment or morality or spirituality, Solomon says in every arena of life, acknowledge him. And that's not some casual tip of the hat to God. It's not, giving God some obligatory shout out. Solomon says, recognize who God is, understand what God has said, and then respond accordingly. And so you and I are called here in Proverbs 3 by the wisest man to ever live outside of Jesus to recognize God's authority over every component of our life, to not simply seek God's will, but to submit to that in every realm of life, in all of our ways. And you'll notice that there comes with that a promise, and that is he will make your road, your way, your path straight. Now, the promise here is not you make whatever decision you want to and God will straighten out your road. The promise is that when we trust in him with all our heart, when we lean on him, and do not lean on our own understanding, when we acknowledge him, he will make our paths straight. That is, we can trust that we're always going to be on the right road. We're traveling on the right way. And so divine direction starts, again, not so much with information as it does with an attitude of submission. And tragically, Solomon becomes both the best and the worst case examples, right? Because in spite of his unmatched knowledge and wisdom, in spite of his tremendous insight, Solomon comes to a point in his life where he fails to heed his own advice. He chooses to trust in his own understanding, and he pays a dear price for it. In 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 1, he there gets involved in a marriage alliance with Pharaoh. He marries Pharaoh's daughter. By the time you get to 1 Kings chapter 11, he has intermarried with a number of different daughters to kings and formed various alliances. By the time all is said and done, he's got, 700 wives and 300 concubines. And that flies in the face of God's very clear teaching in Deuteronomy 17 and verse 17 that Moses says before they ever enter the land, your king shall not multiply silver, shall not multiply horses, and shall not multiply wives. And in that instruction in Deuteronomy chapter 17, Moses says the king is supposed to write that stuff down with the priest looking over his shoulder to make sure he gets it right. And so this had to have been information that Solomon was aware of, and yet he's not leaning on God. He's not trusting in the Lord and what God said. Instead, he's leaning upon his own understanding. It's not talent, it's not information, it's not insight. That's the starting point of staying on the right road. It's simply a matter of submitting to the Lord, that we're leaning on him. I'm a step behind here on the PowerPoint. Let's catch up here. David, on the other hand, his dad, provides a great example. So Solomon becomes the mixed example, good and bad. David becomes a great example of this. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 24. 1 Samuel chapter 24. You'll remember that following his victory over Goliath, that David is very quickly catapulted into Israel's limelight. That David, in essence, becomes famous in Israel in the course of a single day. Within a single day, there now are songs that are being written about him, sung about him. He is a hero in Israel in every sense of the word. The problem is that the current king, Saul, who is an average monarch with an above-average ego, is not all that keen on some young kid taking a place of preeminence. He's not about to be upstaged by a teenage shepherd boy. And so eventually Saul makes a plan, of course, he's going to eliminate David. He's going to take David's life. And so that results in this decade-long cat and mouse game where David is on the run. Saul is trying to find David. As soon as he hears about David's whereabouts, he goes off in pursuit of him, and David is forced to flee once again. And that's when we come to 1 Samuel chapter 24. We're sort of in the midst of that. So look at verse 1 beginning. 1 Samuel chapter 24 and verse 1. Now when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. He came to the sheepfolds on the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. The men of David said to him, Behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I'm about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. It came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him, because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, Far be it from me, because of the Lord, that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. David persuaded his men. Literally here the idea is he had to crush them down is the idea of the word here in the Hebrew. He had to crush down his men with these words and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose, left the cave, and went on his way. Now, verse 1 tells us just how passionate Saul is about eliminating David. They've just got done pursuing the Philistines, and as soon as he hears that David's whereabouts, he orders 3,000 of his men, who have got to be weary from battle, to saddle back up their horses and go in pursuit of one man. And in the midst of that pursuit, the scripture tells us that nature calls. And the king, wanting obviously some element of privacy, picks a random cave in order to take care of business. Now, unbeknownst to the king, David and his men are hiding in the inner recesses of that cave. Now, in terms of conventional wisdom, this is a perfect opportunity for David to end all of the hardship that he and his men have been experiencing. If you read through some of the Psalms, you realize just how difficult and challenging this period of life was for David. David, with a stroke of a sword, could become the thing that Samuel the prophet has already anointed him to be, and that is the king of Israel. It also seems to be providential, and his men point that out. In fact, they go so far as to quote God in verse 4, that clearly this is a God thing, David. I mean, the signs of it are everywhere, and so the pressure for David to act and to take the life of Saul is incredibly high. This is an emotionally charged event, and yet David refuses to be controlled by some misguided passion. Jeremiah the prophet would later write that the heart is deceitful above all else. That is, our hearts have the ability to cloud things as they actually are. Jeremiah 17 and verse 9. It's easy to be swayed by the emotions of a moment, isn't it? To be challenged by conventional wisdom, to surrender to the cultural norm, to pressure by our peers, to past patterns of our own conduct. Oftentimes, the decisions we make in terms of the way we're going to travel on is as simple as the path of least resistance, which seldom takes us where we actually want to go. This is the moment that David has been waiting for. He's entered the cave as a fugitive. He can exit this cave as king. And yet notice that David's restraint makes absolutely no sense to his men. David describes it in verse 6. First of all, he's forbidden from doing anything to his master. Saul is the king. It's against the law to kill the king. And so this was not a situation that David needed to say, hey, let me go pray about this. You know what? I need to study that further. That was something that God had spoken very clearly about. There was no need for David to let me study this matter further. Secondly, David says that he has no intention of violating this principle that God was the one who put Saul into place, and I'm not in a position, I don't have the authority to remove that. If God wants Saul out of the way, then God's the one who's going to have to do it. There's a third thing that's implied here, and that is that his decision not to take Saul's life will later be realized to be the wise thing. Now, to his men right here, seems to be the foolish thing. But eventually it's going to be seen as the wise thing. That's why it's recorded here by the Holy Spirit. Because David looked down the road. David understood where this decision is going to take him. That this account, if he takes Saul's life, it is a story that will be told and retold for generations. This will be a part of his legacy. Remember, every road takes you somewhere. If you're on that road, it's going to take you to where that road leads. Oftentimes, events are interconnected. And David does not want the storyline of his reign to be predicated on him making a surprise attack on a king who's in a vulnerable moment while he's going to the bathroom. That's not how David wants his story to be told. That's not what he wants to be a part of his legacy. He understands that's going to mar my reputation forever. That's going to emphasize not my trust in God, not the fact that I'm leaning on the Lord. It's going to emphasize my own cunning and my own actions rather than trusting in the provision and the protection of God. And so, in spite of all of the emotions that are going on at this moment, in spite of it having the appearance of it being a golden opportunity provided by God, in spite of the strong prompting of his men, David's able to see where that decision is going to take him. And in his refusal to take Saul's life, he models this powerful truth, and that is that you never are going to get to where you want to go by breaking God's law, by violating God's principles, by ignoring God's wisdom. That when it comes to navigating the narrow way, leaning on God means that we are constantly asking ourselves three questions. What's God said on the matter? And number two, what's the outcome that I'm expecting, and does the decision that I'm contemplating, is it going to take me there? And number three, what story do I want it to tell? Is it going to tell a story of me being faithless, or is it going to be a case of it telling a story of me being faithful? The second point involves heeding the right counsel. Heeding the right counsel. You can go ahead and make your way to the book of Proverbs again if you would. I'll give you a head start. I'm frequently amazed at how resistant people are to taking advice from people who are already where they want to be. And I'm equally amazed at how many people are quick to borrow a page out of the playbook of somebody who's never been where they want to be. Now let me give you an example of what I'm talking about there. If you are a parent of a small child and you want some counsel, instead of going to your friends, why not find somebody in this church who's got great kids, who clearly has succeeded in raising their kids to love the Lord, and go to them. Go to them and get your counsel. People are just, it boggles my mind that they will get counsel from the people that have the least experience and have the least knowledge on something. Having friends in our age bracket is great, in our season of life. The problem with it is that they're not any further down the road of life than what we are. And so they make great companions, they just don't always make good counselors. Now, I'm not saying that they won't, that they're going to steer you wrong. But when you take your counsel from people in your own season of life, when you follow the direction of somebody who's never been where you're wanting to go, and sometimes it's even worse, you're taking counsel from someone who's lost, we'd never think of doing that physically. If we're going to ask directions on how to get somewhere, I don't want to hear from you who's never been there. I want to talk to somebody who's been there. How do you get there? And obviously, on a lot of these spiritual matters, the implications are far greater than just driving around in circles for an hour. Imagine how much better we would navigate the narrow way if we were more intentional about who we got our counsel from. How many dead ends could we avoid? How much regret could we eliminate? How much better would our choices be if we ignored the counsel, resisted the lifestyles of those who are not where we want to go, and instead seek counsel from those who've already proven they can get to where we want to be? Now, in the book of Proverbs, Solomon, on a number of occasions, speaks to this idea of seeking outside counsel. Look at chapter 1. Let's start there in verse 5. We'll just look at a few passages here. In chapter 1 and verse 5, Solomon says, "A wise man will hear and increase in learning, and a man of understanding will acquire wise counsel." Chapter 11. Chapter 11 and verse 14. In chapter 11 and verse 14, "Where there is no guidance, the people fall, but in abundance of counselors, there is victory." Chapter 12, verse 15. "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes." That he's leaning on his own understanding. "But a wise man is he who listens to counsel." One more, chapter 13 and verse 10. Chapter 13 and verse 10, "Through insolence comes nothing but strife, but wisdom is with those who receive counsel." We could look at several other ones here in the book of Proverbs. But those Proverbs convey some pretty simple principles, don't they? That wise people listen to the counsel of others, and they prosper as a result. Foolish people, on the other hand, refuse to listen, and they pay the price. How many difficult roads in life could we avoid if we just was willing to set aside our pride and ask for directions? Now, let me just say, I know this is a predominantly male problem. That's physical directions. Spiritual directions is sometimes equal between the genders. We think we know the way to go. We don't want to, we perceive it to be weak to go and ask somebody else. But according to Solomon, the wisest man outside of Jesus, he says that no one ever gets to a good place because they themselves are so smart, so insightful, so experienced that they don't need outside input. Instead, he says wise people are always listening. They're listening to the right people. That's how they got to be wise. And that's how they stay wise. Now, it's not just a matter of listening to the right counsel, or listening to counsel, it's finding the right counsel, isn't it? And Solomon's son, Rehoboam, bears this out. So following the death of Solomon, Solomon's declaration, sorry, I'm behind one. Here we find Rehoboam. And you remember that Rehoboam, he becomes king after his father's death, and there's very quickly, as at his coronation, there is a group of disgruntled people that show up led by Jeroboam. And if you look at 1 Kings chapter 12, in 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 4, they level a complaint, but they also make what is a fairly generous offer here. In 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 4, your father made our yoke hard. Now, therefore, lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke, which he put on us, and we will serve you. Solomon's aggressive building program had taken a toll on the people. They're tired, they have been heavily taxed, and they're looking for relief. And so they promise their devotion to Rehoboam if he will respond to them mercifully. Wisely, Rehoboam asked for some time to decide. He says, give me 3 days. And that was smart. Don't make a rash decision. Take some time to think through this. He says, come back to me in 3 days. Verse 5. During that time, he seeks out counsel. He begins by seeking out counsel from his father's advisors. Now, these are men who have a perspective that only time and life experience can provide to them. Also, because they're not his counselors, they're his daddy's counselors, there's nothing for them really to gain or lose by telling him the truth on the matter. And so in verse 7, they spoke to him saying, if you will be a servant to the people today and will serve them and grant them their petition and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. Sadly, however, Rehoboam is not looking for sound advice. What Rehoboam is looking for is affirmation. What he wants is somebody to tell him what he wants to hear, somebody who's going to validate what he has already decided. And so in verse 8, he forsook the counsel of the elders, which they had given him, and consulted with the young men who grew up with him, his peers. And by the way, notice this, men who served him, not served his dad, but served him. These are guys who aren't any further down the road of life than what Rehoboam is. And they tell him exactly what he wants to hear in verses 10 and 11. They spoke to him, saying, thus you shall say to this people who spoke to you, saying, your father made our yoke heavy, now you make it lighter for us. But you shall speak to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Whereas my father loaded you up with a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. 3 days later, when the contingent led by Jeroboam returns, Rehoboam communicates a decision based on counsel, and it's a decision that isn't just going to affect him. It is going to negatively affect the entire nation of Israel. It's going to result in the division of the kingdom and civil war. Now, there's a couple of things we can learn from Rehoboam's bad example here. Number one, seeking counsel is only beneficial if you're discriminating in terms of who you're getting it from. And number two, the best counsel in the world is wasted if you've already got your mind made up. People come to me all the time and say, hey, what do you think I ought to do? Well, here's what I think you ought to do. Well, I don't like that. Okay, well, that's your choice. You don't have to like it. But here's what I think. I want to do this over here. And they go do that, and guess what? They don't end up where they want to go. But they've already had their mind made up. And that's where Rehoboam was. I like what one man said. He said, pride is hard to see in the bathroom mirror. It's easy to see in the rear view. That's true, isn't it? And then third and finally, keep your eyes on the road. Keep your eyes on the road. I don't know how driver's ed works in Arkansas, but back in the olden days, when I stepped off of the ARC, we actually had driver's ed was a part of our high school curriculum. I got a half a credit for a semester of driver's ed, and it was great because, when you weren't driving, when you weren't in class, you got to go to the library and we called it study hall. We all know how that works, right? But one of the things that I remember, I don't remember a lot, one of the things I do remember about driver's ed is that there was a lot of emphasis placed on keeping your eyes where they needed to be. Because there's a tendency, especially among younger drivers, to let a host of other things distract us to catch our attention. Now today, we've actually got a term for it. We call it distracted driving. that if you're on the phone, if you're sending a text message, by the way, I was texting Bruce yesterday, 75, 80 miles an hour on a interstate, probably not a good idea. I was speaking it, though, by the way, so I was speaking it. If you're sending email, there is a much greater chance of you being involved in an accident, right? We all acknowledge that. We said earlier that it's direction, not intention, that determines our destination. Let's add another element to the mix here. It's what captures our attention that determines our direction and therefore ultimately can lead to our destination. The things that we give our attention to, that's what influences the direction of our lives. So we can't afford to be distracted by the wrong things. That we need to keep our eyes on the road, that we need to stay focused on our destination, that we need to pay attention. There is an inherent in that terminology that there's a price that's attached to this. Look at Proverbs chapter 4. Proverbs chapter 4, and then we'll wrap up our class. Proverbs chapter 4, beginning in verse 25. Going back to the words of the wise Solomon. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 25, beginning, he says, "Let your eyes look directly ahead." This is Proverbs 4 and verse 25. "Let your eyes look directly ahead, and let your gaze be fixed straight in front of you. Watch the path of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Do not turn to the right nor to the left. Turn your foot from evil." Solomon says, be alert to the distractions. Be careful what you're paying attention to, because those are the things, those are the people that are directing the way that you're on, the road that you're traveling. Be selective in terms of your friends. Work hard at the spiritual development of your kids. Don't allow other things to distract you from that incredible mission. Be working at developing your own relationship with God, and don't allow things of the world to distract you from those kinds of things. There is not a literal yellow brick road for us to follow, but there is a divine roadmap. And yet even then, it's not just knowing that there is a map that makes the difference. It's going where the map says. It's doing what God has instructed. And so choose your road wisely. Make sure this morning that the road that you're traveling on, especially the one spiritually, is taking you where you want to go. Am I on the narrow road, or am I on the broad path? Because the broad path, Jesus makes very clear where it's taking you. And Jesus is very clear where the narrow road is taking you. So which of those two roads are you on? And make sure that you don't just start the narrow path, but you do the things in your life necessary to maintaining your travel on that narrow path. The three things we talked about this morning. Thank you so much for your kind attention this morning. Hope it's been helpful to you.